Hello once again, everyone. So today I want to talk a little bit about identifying a bad parry. Now what I mean by this is not in regards to identifying it yourself, but instead in regards to when you are first learning to do combination attacks, or as we talked about last week, doing strong opening attacks, you need to start being able to see what effect this is having on the person you're fighting. So I've got three different kinds of weapons before me. I'm going to kind of go between them as I need to. But in general, when I say bad parry, I'm not even necessarily meaning a horrendous parry. I'm just meaning that it's something that you should be, mind you, nothing's ever a guarantee, but you should be able to, and relatively safe, moving on to your next attack from this. So let's look at just some general concepts first. And for this, I'll go ahead and grab my backsword. But some general things I mean here, right? If it's a really, really terrible parry, then it won't be a parry at all and you'll blow through. So that's kind of off the table, as it were. Instead, we're talking about something that does manage to cover them, but does not leave them in a position wherein they can attack back in an efficient manner, rather. Though we will discuss when they can attack back and kind of exploiting that. But either way, some general things to look out for. Number one is going to be movement, right? And also active engagement. So this may be a little woo-woo because I can't actually necessarily demonstrate it, but essentially when you throw in attacks, you're going to be building up momentum and rhythm, right? And this has been given many different terms in various different systems. In this case, think of it as the vor, to use the German one, right? When I have the vor, it's more than just I am attacking first. It's much more in regards to I am forcing the person I'm fighting to acknowledge what I am doing and drop into a defensive action of some kind, i.e. the nach. Now, this is something that on paper you can try and define, but is more going to be something you sense. You've got initiative. You've got the upper hand. You are driving the person where you want them to. This is in general a pretty good baseline indicator of you should continue to work. Not always, mind you, as it can be taken back in a moment, but in general, if you have someone wrapped around your finger, is almost kind of the way I like to think of it, off most of their parries, you should be able to turn that into something else because they are parrying where you want them to from the get-go. So that's kind of the base level. The second level onto this would be in regards to movement. So I often say you have to move on either your attack or your defense when it comes to a parry or a post. Ideally, you move on both of them, and that can vary in regards to what kind of movement you're doing. The kind of three main types. You have a retreating movement with your parry, which is particularly good if you're looking to just leave and not riposte, though certainly if you're anticipating a secondary attack, 1, 2, you can set yourself up against both of them. A lateral movement is going to be something that you can do if you can't retreat, so it can still be done in regards to just getting distance, or it can be done to set up a new line, 1, 2, for example, or alternatively, 1, guard again for my 2. And then the final one is a forward motion. That being, an attack has come in and I am moving into it in some way. It can even be very, very subtle to create a better parry. So for example, if I put my backsword down, a good example of this would be Fiore's style of wedging. So for example, a lot of Fiore's plays from the long guard are going to be left foot forward. I don't believe he's staying stagnant. I do believe that he's doing one of two things. Either stepping forward with a little accrescimento, vabbè, di crescere, or alternatively, you've got your powerful positions that are adding that turn. That is still movement, even if you don't cover a ton of physical distance, because it's applying things forward. So, that out of the way. If someone is not moving, basically taking any of those options, even to a small degree, this is usually a good time for you to continue attacking. The idea being there that if I move, right, so if an attack is coming in and I move, that allows me to not only put more physical distance between that incoming attack and me, but it also allows me to get the full extension of whatever I want to do anywhere I need to, right? When you attack someone, you're usually going to be hitting them with about here up. And that's true of pretty much any sword. The further away from the person you get when you step back, the more you're only dealing with this portion, which is the most dangerous portion. You don't have to worry about the lever, you don't have to worry about anything along those lines. In general, moving back allows you to have all those things. Moving sideways gives you the same idea. Now rather than me being in line with the threat, I am literally to its side, one way or the other. That's now past me, as it were. Moving forward allows me to do somewhat of the same thing. I am now pushing that threat past me. Think of this akin to if it's a gun barrel, once it's not at you, you're not as scared of it anymore, right? So, the general idea there being if someone is not moving, they're not getting any of these properties. And furthermore, they're allowing you to set up a lot more around them. This is, usually I refer to this as turning someone into a human pell. If someone is going to just guard without moving their feet, right? So they just move their hands wherever they need to, however they need to, and however well, you then get the chance and choice to work off of that to a great degree. So for example, let's say that someone is holding kind of a middling defense, right? So they're blocking pretty well, and they're keeping right about here, but they're not moving at all. They're not changing the game. Well, that gives you free reign to exploit whatever side they've just opened. They parry over here, you can move as far as you physically can, right? Parry over here, same thing as well. If you have someone that's driving outside of their frame, so they're parrying much more extended, right? Or even allowing themselves to curl in some manner, same exact thing applies, but now they are opening up that center. And since they didn't move, your target area is still there. So if we go back to talking about our strong opening cuts, I want to be driving down into my target to force them to defend. If they move, I now have to reassess where they're going and prepare myself for the next action. If they don't, that means that all I need to do is align myself to direct my next attack. The target is still directly in front of me. So this gives a lot of particularly good opportunities in regards to linear sort of fighting. So for example, within backsword, if they're staying directly in front of me, but I am causing them to drive their hands out, it is a very small motion to go right into center line with a variety of things. In regards to rapier and using thrusts, same thing. If they're driving themselves away from that center line, I can take my sweet time. And this is something you often see in regards to counteractions against people who are cutting, or rather who are cut heavy at you. Keep the long point. Either way. So against people who aren't moving, this is why you have that advantage. They're not changing the game. They are defending themselves, and don't be wrong, some people are very good holding their ground and then getting quick ripostes off of this. But they are always running the risk of you getting to continue to set the stage. So, depending upon who you're fighting, this can be a good first indicator. Our second indicator is going to be disconnection, right? So maybe they are moving, but they're moving a little bit ungainly. So this can be an indication of two things. Number one, a desperate parry, and number two, a less experienced person. So, what do I mean by this? Basically, let's say I am going to move my parry. I'll go ahead and do a simple one. So I'm going to traverse with St. George, and then move into the inside guard as I complete my action. A tight one should be, even though I am sidestepping, I'm not leaving my sword behind me. I'm covering where I'm going as well as where I am, and then moving out of it. And this is true of any weapon you're going to do. A more ungainly would be wherein I am disconnecting my hand in one way or the other. Maybe I'm pushing it too much against your weapon, so when I step, I'm now outside of the shape that I just made, which also means that I now have to do a bigger return motion to complete my second guard. Another example of this would be, if we look at the longsword, for example, I see this quite a bit in regards to people. They'll try to move with it, but they'll either curl up too much, not connected, or they will step out too much. Now the hands are not connected to you anymore, and it's going to be harder for you to either initiate a secondary action or a secondary parry, right? Secondary action, I guess, defines both attack and defense, but either way. Now, spotting this is going to be something you're just going to kind of get an eye for. If you know what's right, you'll be able to recognize what's wrong. And mind you, when I say desperate parry, I don't necessarily mean a bad thing, but for example, let's look at, this is one that I have done semi-recently, in regards to the short edge deflection. So a good one should be, I keep myself relatively in place, but I'm getting a lot out of it. So there is still kind of movement here as a sort. A not so great one that I had to do recently was, I cut, I was expecting to get a bind, I did not, they slept off it, I had to very much throw my body out of the way and my sword up. I got really lucky that I really just got lucky on this parry, got out of the way, and then escaped. But it was very much a moment of disconnect because two things activated at the same time. My brain said, hey, we need to use the action we were just primed for. My body said, hey, I don't think that's going to happen. We need to get out of the way. And that leads to a rather disconnected, desperate parry. Once you start identifying these things, you can usually exploit it in one of two ways. One, the important thing to be aware of is that they're going to possibly do their follow-up action. Very few people just parry, right? But especially once you start, fencing people who have been around the block at least a little bit, which is really where you need this. If they parry desperately, they may abandon it and try to leave, or they may try to throw the action they had in mind, even though their body is no longer behind it. So let's look at that, for example. The most common thing you'll do out of this false edge parry is deflect, then straight back down, or around to the side. If my neuron, and I'm in my panic state, desperate parry, I may still try to throw that blow, even though my feet are not behind me. If you can anticipate this, rather than trying to get the hit a secondary action, let my not so great return hit be something you set yourself against. So let's talk counteractions. Anytime that someone attacks at you, you have two options. You can defend, or you can counterattack. Right? These are kind of the main things. You could also technically avoid, but we're going to go off defend and counterattack. Counterattacks don't only have to be after initial actions. They can be in follow-up actions. In fact, that's usually where they're going to be their most devastating. Someone has already attacked me once, twice, maybe we're 3 actions in, they throw that sloppy extra blow that they shouldn't, and I get to take all the time in the world now that I really have the measure of them to destroy that, to keep on them. It may not even necessarily hit them, but it does make sure that in that situation, desperate parry, desperate attack, where am I going to go? My feet aren't behind me. This was my one last salvo. If it gets stopped on something, regardless of whether or not you hit me, my only choice now is to try and leave. I see this happen a lot, actually, especially when people throw one more cut than they should when they're trying to withdraw. And this can come out of disconnected parries or panic states. Now, like I said, the other thing people may do is they may just try to flat retreat. In this case, you should absolutely pursue them, hound them, stick on them. You got them out of position, they're now trying to literally find their feet again. This is a good time for you to spring forward and drive them into more desperate parries. So far we've got not moving at all, we've got disconnected hands. You'll often see these sometimes in conjunction, wherein someone will reach out too far, will parry with the wrong part of the blade, usually too close to the fort, or things along those lines. What are some other indicators? Well, another indicator is, and for this I'm grabbing the rapier, another indicator of a not so great parry can be entirely leaving the game and or setting up for the wrong action. So what I mean by here, and this is why I grabbed the rapier in particular. So this is at its best when I'm playing the central game of some sort, right? Either I'm here, even if my hand is withdrawn, I'm still very much keeping right here. Even if my tip is going low or high, the guard is still centralized, because that's what's saving it. Wherein someone does a parry that causes them to move, even if they're keeping this central cone, but they're going too far up or too far down, right, or even too far to the side, even though they feel like they're doing right, they've opened themselves up a lot more than they've intended to. This can almost be thought of doing too much of a good thing, right? So, for example, an attack comes in and I want to parry it into porta, but rather than just keeping my tip in the central line and creating a wedge, I move my whole guard over. Yes, I have definitely locked that down, but I've made myself too open while doing so. You can only trade, it's safety versus, there's not really a great way to summarize it, but basically, there is a trade-off. If you really lock down a line, you must open another. A time I see this a lot in regard, besides rapier, is I also see this a lot in regards to winding with longsword. In general, you want to be either here or here. These are two strong points that lead to good places. But a lot of times, especially on this low one, people feel that they need to be more here. This, however, is weakening them. because now, rather than my hands being connected to here, they're outside of me, and they no longer have the same pressure they do. This also gets into the kind of wider category of mental how suck, but either way. In theory though, since I get a lot of leverage with my edge on them, and I'm trying to get leverage that way, this should be good. When it would probably be better if you need more leverage to wedge up. Because again, the point is to get the scary thing, this, offline, not the entire shape. So, too much of a good thing. Another good indicator, right? Now, one more kind of not so great parrying thing you'll see is also, and this one kind of blends into the first one as well in regards to not moving, is not good distance sense, right? Now this can mean a couple things. It can mean parrying too far out, so reaching for parries, but that kind of goes into what we were talking about before, right? Too much of a good thing, right? Or it can mean in regards to pulling your arms too close to you, right? This in particular usually comes up in backsword, saber, and other one-handed swords. So, ideally, I want to keep the fight out and away from me, using my footwork to supplement that in case I physically cannot with my hand. However, there will be times when an attack manages to get in deep enough, and if I cannot move my feet in time, this is usually what happens, so I can't move my feet enough, the hand has to come back further than it normally would to keep myself safe. Now what this does is very much like the too much of a good thing, it will always open up another side because I've moved close. But more so than that, it also pretty much guarantees that my tip will no longer be a threat. Now it's not to say that some people can't get very good at these quick, tight to them parries and almost kind of become like a ball of steel. But in general, in having to come back like this for these closer covers, if my tip is still out, this doesn't protect me. I'm making a shape, i.e., I'm now stuck having to take a longer action to come out. And this would be another situation wherein you could look for provoking, catching their not so great catching their not so great riposte with a counteraction, and then hitting them. And this happens in all sorts of swords. You will see it in regards to the rapier, wherein people will thrust, and rather than, again, parrying with the tip or pushing it too far off to the side, because that tip gets relatively close, they pull their fort close to them to try and get that extra leverage. Another example would be in the longsword. You'll especially see this when people are using the whole Zwerg spam thing. The hand's getting way, way too close, opens up more of the body. Now, what you may have noticed is that a lot of these things kind of combine into each other. And there's kind of good reason. One of these factors tends to snowball into the others and can cause what you thought might be, it's okay, I can get away with it, into a larger problem, especially in regards to then continuing your attacks. So this is where we now get into your part of it. So you've identified that someone has done a not so great parry. Just because that opportunity is there does not mean that you have to take it there, right? Does not even mean that you'll get it there. So the main things to be aware of are, number one, someone who likes to hold their ground and will throw an attack. Regardless of how competent that attack may be, that is going to come out. If that happens, you are better off still provoking it, but then being ready to defend against their desperate follow-up attack, or competent follow-up attack, and then hitting them afterwards, right? Kind of seeding the ground. Another thing that may happen is someone has defended poorly, realizes this is not so great, and is trying to retreat. This is where you need to hound them. Keep on them, don't let them get their footing. Because until they do, you pretty much have almost free reign in regards to where you can drive them, because they must respect what you're doing. The other thing that may happen is you find opportunity in one not so great parry to provoke another one, and this is where you're going to really start to find a lot of good feint actions. So a lot of people like to use feints initially. That can work, don't get me wrong, but in general, against someone who's pretty competent and knows what's going on, that's not a great decision. However, if you've gotten someone into the back foot, right, literally, they know they have to defend because here comes that other attack. This would be a very good time, since they're not on their best game and cannot launch a counteraction, to provoke them into doing another parry and then pull it and hit them. This kind of, down the line sort of feinting is a very, very good strategy, I find, especially if you're fighting someone who has been around the block a couple times. But in summation, right, or surmising, what are the attributes of a not great parry that you should go in on? Lack of movement, disconnected hands and sword from the body, the idea that they are, kind of responding to you, that you've got them wrapped around your finger, too much of a good thing, i.e. they're reaching out too much, or they're locking down lines too much, thus opening another, and then finally, curling up or moving closer to them. If you see these actions, you should be able to start exploring into attacking other things, and I recommend this is not going to magically make you be able to see these. Take time in your sparring, in your practices, to see when these things occur, jot them down in your mind, and then later, as you're becoming more competent with them, that's when you start attacking and really exploiting these. And they're not going to happen all the time, but when they do, they're going to be a very lovely opportunity for you. But otherwise, thank you very much for watching. We'll go over some other techniques another time.